Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us. We're still just waiting for a couple of people, so I'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to join and then we'll make a start. We're very excited to have you here, and just to tell you that we are going to record this webinar so we can share it with people who can't join us today, and we'll also share the slides with you afterwards. So don't worry about trying to write down any URLs or notes or anything. Okay, so I think the first thing we should do is start with a quick round of introductions. And so I think some of you have met me, but I'm Charlie Pinder and I work on the OC4IDS and the OCDS help desk. So I'll be working with everybody to help them out getting started with the data standards and doing things like scoping and mapping. And if we haven't had a scoping call with you yet, then we'll be in touch and it'll be great to get that kicked off. David, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Hi, everyone. My name is David Opoku. I am the Data and Partner Support Manager at OCP, which means that I help with training, learning resources, development, and I'm based in Accra, Ghana. So we'll be supporting Charlie with the hackathon delivery. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks very much, David. And Ben is also on the call. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Thanks, Charlie. Hi, I'm Ben Ferns. I'm Head of Infrastructure for the Open Contracting Partnership, and I'm also Head of Asia for Infrastructure and All Public Procurement. We're sponsoring, in conjunction with the presidency in Taiwan and a couple of other partners, the Taiwan Hackathon. So we're really excited to be working with all of you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ben. And so what would be helpful if someone from each team could just introduce your team name and your project title very briefly about what your project is about. So perhaps Open Development Cambodia, would you like to kick us off? You may need to unmute yourself to introduce yourself.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
Yep, nice to see everyone. My name is Marty from ODC, and today I'm not alone. I'm with my colleague as well.
Great, welcome. And what's the title of your project?
We will be participating in InfraHack, working on the budget and the project of infrastructure in Cambodia.
Great, thank you very much. And Maz team, would you like to introduce yourselves briefly?
Yeah, hi everyone. I am Balan from Maz team, and my team is here together with me. And also Muntada team is also here. We are sharing the same laptop and session and projecting onto the projector.
Okay, great. So we have two teams from Malaysia here today. Fantastic.
Yep. Hello, this is Saifuddin.
Hello, welcome. And Michael from Infrastructure Partnerships Australia.
Hi, yes, so my name's Michael and I've got my colleague here, Rob, as well. So we're from, as Charlie said, Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. Our project is in infrastructure as well, and particularly related to our resource, the Australia-New Zealand Infrastructure Pipeline on infrastructure.org, infrastructurepipeline.org, and we're looking to utilise the OC4IDS on that platform, and as well the data standard that the New South Wales government's implemented here in Australia.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Do we have any other teams here who haven't introduced themselves yet? Nope. Okay, fantastic. So let's crack on. So why we wanted to have this webinar was essentially to support you with an understanding of OC4IDS and OCDS before the hackathon. I know lots of you are doing lots of prep work So we thought it would be helpful to have a webinar just to introduce the concepts and talk about how they fit together. So this is really about the foundational understanding of what the data standards are, and also to give you a quick overview of the sorts of resources and tools and implementation guidance that are available to support you as you start off with your projects. And we'll also be looking at some alternative implementation models, so really looking at how you can start to use these data standards. And we'll be talking about key concepts, things like use cases and project identifiers, but also with the emphasis on it's not just us explaining all about the data standards to you. We're also really interested in all the difficulties and advantages that you find of applying these data standards to your different projects. So we would really like to have lots of feedback. Particularly today, there's a chance for questions. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and we'll also have some time for questions at the end. But throughout the whole hackathon process, we would really like to learn from you what works, what doesn't, and the data standards are very much an evolving thing. So they need to work for the publishers and for the end users. So they will change over time in response to what works for the community. Okay, so let's get started with looking at the foundations of OC4IDS. And it's really built on two things. So it's built on the cost infrastructure data standard and also on the open contracting data standard, OCDS. Okay, so I think some or all of you will have worked with OCDS data before, but you might not have come across OC4IDS. So let's take a quick look at each in turn. So COST is the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, and what they did was they developed an infrastructure data standard, which is essentially a list of information about what should be disclosed, and it's all about the effective monitoring of infrastructure projects. So it's not actually a data standard in the usual sense, because it doesn't actually say how to structure or format the data, as we'll see later with OCDS, and you may know yourselves with OC4IDS that it says precisely what fields to publish in what way and what they mean, but IDS just says what to disclose. Okay, so it looks at infrastructure projects essentially in two main categories of information. So it's the projects and their related contracts, and it's a list of what needs to be disclosed at each phase of the project. So covering identification, preparation, and completion as the project goes along. And then with the open contracting data standard, it's essentially about increasing participation in public contracting. So it's all about disclosing joined up data across the whole of the contracting process. And then publishers and civil society organisations and users can use that data as the basis of reform. And OCDS is a true data standard because it both says what information that you should publish, but also how specifically you structure and format that data. So the idea is to make it as easy as possible to use. So if everyone agrees on what the data means and how to structure and format it, then it's really easy for someone to reuse it in a different context and to build tools that OCDS data can work in for everybody. And there on the right of your screen, if you haven't seen any of the OCDS data, the schema, this is essentially the rules about what to disclose and in what way. So for example, you can see that the release date here has a title of release date. It's got a description saying exactly what the information should be, and it's got a type, so it has to be a string, but also it has to be formatted as a date time. So any machine or human trying to read the data standard will know that in the date field should be a date time string. So I've just seen a question there from someone, so we are going to share the presentation afterwards, so don't worry too much about taking notes, just listen along, and please ask questions as well if you need any clarification on the things I'm saying or would like more details. So this slide is a quick overview of the Open Contracting Data Standard, and the point is it's about the whole of the contracting process. So it's not just about tenders, and it's not just about contracts as it's often published, but it's about the whole process. It's all the way from planning through to delivery and payment. And OCDS sees a unique contracting process as all the planning, tendering information, awards, contracts, and contract implementation information, all related to a single initiation process. And that initiation process may be a tender or a direct contract award. So the initiation can be different in each case. But the point is that an individual contracting process has lots of different stages, and we bring it together with a OCID. So that is the single contracting process identifier. So that's how we know that these stages are related to each other. And when we look at project identifiers later in OC4IDS, the key point is that there's an identifier to tie the different bits of the project together. So we'll be talking a lot about identifiers today. Okay, and of course, as well as publishing the data, we really want to focus on the users of OCDS data, and all of your projects are all about enabling data reuse. So briefly, OCDS is about 4 distinct use cases, and it's really, OCDS was designed to meet lots of different user needs. So essentially, this understanding value for money. So better value for money in new contracts, and understanding the value achieved in previous contracts. So be able to look back at previously published data and to evaluate how they fared. Also about detecting fraud and corruption. So it's often, OCDS data is often used to scrutinize procurement documents and data for red flags. So which might indicate that some public monies are being misused. And I think one of your projects is about that sort of detection of possible problems within procurement. And it's also about helping private firms compete for contracts. So OCDS data can be used to understand the potential pipeline of procurement opportunities. So as the Australia project is looking about pipeline data, it's essentially to try and drive competition, and with the idea that more competition results in better value for money as well. And finally, it's the importance of monitoring service delivery. So monitoring groups want to make sure that public contracting, which is an awful lot of money, actually delivers value to citizens in terms of the quality of the goods or works or services provided. And so OCDS data can be used to join up data on budgets, contracts and implementation in order to give people the information that they need to monitor service delivery properly. Okay, is everybody happy with the, has anybody got any questions so far? Okay, so very briefly to talk about why do we need to have OCDS in the first place. I think you, as part of your projects, you've been looking around for some contracting data, and you may have encountered some of these problems. So often there's only limited data on contracting available, or the publishing may still take place on paper. Governments don't always have a central source of contracting data, and there's often a limit in what data is published. So, for example, some governments only publish data about tenders, and we found that very few governments publish data particularly on the implementation stage. And it also can be difficult to link up data between tenders and awards, and joining up the data from the different stages is a particular challenge. And also, the data can be hard to interpret. So without a data standard, the meaning of the fields in the published data is unclear. So for example, if you just had a value related to a tender or award, it's not really clear what that value means unless you also have a currency associated with it. Or you might have a company number to identify a company involved in a contracting process, and without an idea of where those numbers are from, it's very difficult for people to be able to track the different companies throughout the data. And finally, we found that the data that's published is often based just on what's available or what used to be published on paper, rather than around the users of contracting data, what they actually need to know. So the OCDS really tries to join up the data publishers and the data users to create feedbacks, ultimately to try and drive some positive change in public contracting. So governments might tend to focus on a specific use case when they're deciding what contracting data to publish and how to publish it. But OCDS tries to address a really broad range of problems and user needs. So what we've tried to do is do the thinking for the governments for them in terms of how to structure and publish the data, specifically in a way that encourages use and reuse. And then we also provide OCDS provides a set of recommended information to disclose across the whole contracting process. And throughout that publication process, so working with governments to create this data, we also promote engagement with users and feedback loops and iterative development. So essentially what we want to do is to ensure that contracting data is useful, usable, and in use. And similarly with OC4IDS, we want to ensure that project infrastructure data is useful, usable, and in use. So if you haven't already seen the documentation for OCDS, please do go and look at the site. It's got the standard actually on the site with the schema, but the standard website should be your first point of reference, and we do keep the standard documentation up to date, and it takes precedence over any other materials about OCDS, so do check the website for the latest information. And I also wanted to flag up that there's a data review tool on the supporting site. So this gives you the opportunity to evaluate data against the OCDS standard. And for OC4IDS, we don't have a data review tool yet. We do have various ways for you to validate against the schema, but we are building a data review tool, so that should be available shortly. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour of OCDS. I think most of you have probably encountered OCDS before, so let's have a quick summary of the cost IDS and OCDS, which will help us to understand where OC4IDS comes in. So as you can see, we have the cost IDS on the left and the OCDS on the right, and where they differ is essentially around their disclosure guidance and what that disclosure describes. So cost IDS sets out categories of information to be disclosed, but it doesn't actually say anything about how to disclose that information, whereas OCDS is really specific about how to structure and format specific fields of data. So what OC4IDS does is it brings together the data models from OCDS and the categories of information from cost IDS. So cost IDS has all the useful information about what data people want to know about infrastructure projects, and OCDS provides a means to produce structured and standardized data. So we have ended up with OC4IDS. So let's pause very briefly before we go into the details of OC4IDS to say really get clear on precisely what we mean by an infrastructure project. So OC4IDS reuses cost definition of an infrastructure project. So it is the development of a set of infrastructure assets in a specified location, generally the responsibility of a single procuring entity and budget authority. So I know that several of you are working on visualizations on maps of infrastructure projects. So the fact that it's in a specified location lends itself well to that sort of data visualization. So an infrastructure project, it may stand alone, or for example, if you're building a new school or a new hospital, or it may form part of a larger program of work. So a new station as part of a new railway line. And there are typically multiple contracts. So there's often a design phase, a construction and supervision set of contracts for each in each infrastructure project. So an important point to notice is that OC4IDS isn't quite as simple as just using OCDS to disclose the information in the cost IDS, because a single infrastructure project can have lots of associated contracts. And we also have some data on projects that's independent of contracts, so at a slightly higher level, so sort of metadata about projects. So what we needed was a new data model to capture the project level data and then connect it up with the contract level data. And OCDS provides the models and structures for which we can reuse to represent many of the elements in the cost IDS. So just a quick example about structuring data. So here's an example of an element from cost IDS, which is known as contract firms. So at the top you can see it just says field contract firms, and then below there's the equivalent building block, so which includes multiple fields. So you can see that OC4IDS below goes into much more detail about exactly what to disclose. For example, we want the name, and OCDS provides descriptions for each field. So you can agree or understand when you look at some data or the name field in an organization building block in OC4IDS, and you know that this is the common name for this organization, and you know that it should be formatted as a string. And then if we look at the identifier scheme, this is a way to help us understand precisely what organization it is. So the scheme may come from a code list. So these are different ways of specifying particular fields in line with a set of codes that everyone can use and reuse. So we know that people are specifying the same thing if they use the same codes. Okay, so let's have a quick look at why this makes data easier and the opportunities it opens up. So we've populated some of this information with an example from the UK. So because cost IDS isn't specific about exactly what information should be provided about the contract firms, nor about how it might be structured or formatted, it can be really problematic for users. So if they're trying to understand perhaps how many projects a particular organisation is involved in, or which supplier won the most contracts, so they might need to extract company names from a block of text, and there might be different spellings or different abbreviations of company names. So you can see at the top we've got Project A, the contract firm is called Balfour Beatty, Project B, Balfour Beatty PLC, and it's not really clear whether they're the same company or different ones. But if we look below, so organisations in OCDS and OC4IDS, there's an identifier object. So it includes fields for the identifier, such as a company registration number. So we can see here that we can see that the ID for this organisation in the scheme that we specify are the same. So not only the ID is the same, so ending in 826 for both, but also the identifier scheme is the same. So I think this is a Companies House register here in the UK, and we have the legal name for this organisation. So if you provide identifiers for organisations, this gives the users the ability to rely on the unique identifier to say that the firm involved in project A and project B are the same, rather than giving them giving the users the problems of trying to work out who the organisations are just by using their name. Okay, so as long as the scheme that the identifier is drawn from tells users how to interpret the identifier, it means that we can use that identifier to link to other data sources, so such as beneficial ownership information. So I know that one of your projects is looking at beneficial ownership information. So I would encourage you to look at how to specify organisations within OC4IDS and OCDS in order that users of the data can identify who exactly that you're talking about. Okay, so let's zoom back out from this specific example back to the whole schema and take a look at what it looks like in practice. So how does it work in practice? So essentially, it describes data at 3 levels. Okay, so level 1 of the OC4IDS schema is the project level. So there's 4 phases that we've identified in modelling projects. So we've got identification, preparation, implementation, and completion phases. And there's a list of important things to disclose at each point. And then level 2 in OC4IDS is the contracting summary level. So what this does is it captures key information about the contracts, including design, construction, and supervision. And then level 3 of OC4IDS is the contract process detail level. So each update and variation to a contract can be monitored, and for transparency purposes, then justifications for explanations for each change can be sought. So level 3 is our OCDS data. You may recognise the green circles from when we looked at OCDS earlier. And then level 1 and level 2 are the additional information that OC4IDS provides about the infrastructure project. And we've talked through different ways of implementing it with a few of you. So it can be implemented project down, so starting from a list of projects and then trying to find the contracts that belong to that project and then set up monitoring of each one. Or it can be implemented contract up, so discovering projects from data in a procurement system, particularly if there's OCDS data already, and then monitoring how those change over time. And the model can support design of things like new transparency portals that use OCDS data, and transparency portals often want to set up software to detect changes between OCDS releases, and then kind of flag those up when those changes are in need of explanation. So it's really driving the use case of trying to monitor infrastructure projects specifically for transparency. So for those transparency portals, the explanation point is key. So each of the updates in the procurement system could represent a change to the tender period, an award above or below the anticipated value, or a change to the scope of the work. So the point here is that accountability is not just about having the data, it also demands that significant elements of that data, particularly changes, are explained. So I think lots of you are looking at ways to generate not only OC4IDS and OCDS data, but to provide an extra explanation layer on top of that, particularly looking at things like visualizing the data and aggregating the data in different ways. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what OC4IDS provides beyond the schema. So what I'll do is I'll give you a quick tour of the documentation site. I think I've sent everybody the links to the documentation before, but if you haven't had a chance to look through it, then I would encourage you to do so. Once again, please use the documentation site as the latest version and your first point of reference. So it overrides any supplementary information or resources. And I'll just take you on a really quick tour of some of the different sections of the documentation if you haven't had a chance to explore them all yet. Getting started is always a good place to get started. And within our Getting Started section, what we do is we try and introduce the key OC4IDS concepts. So we've got things like the definition of an infrastructure project. So everyone, we can all agree on precisely what we're trying to define, and the relationship between infrastructure projects and contracts, how cost IDS and OCDS are structured and what's in there, but also what the structure and the content of OC4IDS is, and the different ways in which OC4IDS can be used. So the last one particularly, how can I use OC4IDS, may really help some of your projects in particular, so please do take a read through that. Then, as you would expect, there's also the schema on the site and a schema browser, which allows you to click through the different fields and see their descriptions and their format. And so that allows you to explore the different fields and structure within OC4IDS. And we also have the reference table, so that lists all the OC4IDS fields and code lists with definitions, so really helps to drive understanding of what should be published in particular fields and exactly what type of information should be included in that. There's also an indication of whether a field is required or not. There's actually very few required fields within OC4IDS because it's a permissive schema, but it's worth knowing that there are a few in there. For example, the project identifier. And in terms of implementing the schema, we also have some step-by-step guides for reference. So again, I think I've sent links to some of these documents to many of you. So the field level mapping template can be really useful for people who have different sources of data, who want to understand how they can create OC4IDS data out of their various sources of data. And something else that you might find helpful, there's an example OC4IDS JSON file, so you can actually see what a populated example file looks like, and it can really help to look at how each section should be populated. So do have a look at that. There's also an overview of what's in the worked example and a little description about exactly what's in there and why. And finally, we also have a set of IDS and OCDS structured mapping tables. So it really outlines the relationship between cost IDS, OC4IDS, and OCDS. So particularly if you have OCDS data, it helps you understand how you map from OCDS back into OC4IDS. Whereas if you're working from IDS elements, it helps you to understand how to map from IDS to OC4IDS. Okay, I hope everyone's all right. Has anyone got any questions so far? Let's just pause there briefly before we go on to actually using OC4IDS. Hopefully that's given you a good overview of the foundations of OC4IDS and a quick look at the schema and the toolkit. Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is take a quick look at using it. And I just wanted to emphasize we have a few implementation models that I'll talk through that we've derived for now, but we're really interested in your experiences to help refine them. And your projects may not exactly fit into them, so we'll be really interested in working with you to understand how your project fits into these models, or whether we need to create some new models for future publishers. So the first scenario is where there is an infrastructure transparency portal, but there isn't any OCDS data. So this model is used by Cost Honduras in their CSOX platform. So data on projects and contracts is manually entered into the system, and then OC4IDS is used to publish the project level data and summary contracting information. But if more detailed contracting data is captured, then that could be published using OC4IDS. So publishing standardized data like this helps to encourage the use of data and the development of reusable tools and methodologies. And then the second implementation model is being used by Cost Ukraine at the moment. So data on projects is manually entered into an infrastructure transparency portal, whilst they've got contracting data in OCDS format from a procurement portal, so they can automatically pull that over. And then they need to link together the project level and contract level data in the transparency portal, ideally using project identifiers. And then OC4IDS is used to publish the project level and summary contracting data, and it actually links back to the original OCDS releases, which are published from the government procurement system. And then scenario 3, we don't have anyone working on this implementation at the moment, but we're expecting to see it in the future. So that's where there's a procurement system, but no infrastructure transparency portal. So I think this may be the case in some of the countries that you're working in. So rather than implementing a separate infrastructure transparency portal, an existing procurement system is adapted or extended to also capture the project level data. Okay, so then the procurement system can then publish both OCDS and OC4IDS. And again, to emphasize, we really want feedback from all of you to help us refine and update our models. So we'll be talking in more in detail with you at the hackathon and afterwards about how we can update these implementation models in line with your experience. I also wanted to emphasize the importance of thinking about your use cases. So it's really important to know about your use cases from the beginning of your implementation. So that really helps to inform your priorities throughout the project and to work out precisely what data fields you want to prioritize publishing. Okay, so very briefly, a couple of key points. So project identifiers, I think I've also sent information through to a few of you about project identifiers. So we've mentioned them a few times, and they're really key to effective infrastructure monitoring and publishing. So including project identifiers in contracting data is just one example. So what we need the project identifiers and project data so that information from the different stages of the project can be brought together. So information on identification, preparation, implementation, and completion. So you remember when we talked about OCDS, we had an OCID identifier, which brings together the different contracting stages of one contracting process. So we really need project identifiers to bring together all the information about the different stages of a project together. And then I just wanted to touch really briefly on the benefits of publishing in OC4IDS or OCDS. So it's really there's lots of benefits to publishing to a data standard. So we have automated checks, so you know that if someone is publishing in OCDS that and it passes the data review tool, you can actually do a structural check to ensure that all of the data has got the correct structure and format, and it's got the required fields. And this means that there's a developing ecosystem of reusable tools, because the tools can rely on the fact that there are common fields in the same format across all the data. And so a tool built for one instance of OCDS will work, or OC4IDS will work across any of the similar sorts of data. And also, because we have specific definitions of each field and guidance, then everyone can agree on what that data actually means, which enables comparison of data between different publishers, and that can really drive value for money and other types of analysis. And also, with an international standard, there's a community of publishers and users to learn from and share your work with. So there's a really collaborative element to publishing in OCDS, and an emerging collaboration around OC4IDS, of which you are part of. And finally, what we have is a scoping template. So I have shared this with a few of you, but it's worth having a look at the scoping template, because it can really help you understand any gaps in your existing data mapping to OC4IDS. And these are the questions that OC4IDS publishers need to consider before starting implementation, so it's worth having a look at. And it's a relatively new resource, so as ever, we're interested in your feedback about it. But you may find that helpful to get started with really thinking about how OC4IDS is going to work in your particular situation. And I also wanted to flag up that OC4IDS is permissive and extensible. So this means that you can add extra fields into the OC4IDS data. So a few of your projects are building dashboards and visualizations. And so if you need extra information within OC4IDS to drive that data reuse, then you can add that in. And as long as you have the core OC4IDS fields in there, then you can still have all the benefits of publishing to a data standard and the tools that will emerge alongside that. So we would encourage you to think about OC4IDS, publishing in OC4IDS as an incremental process. So mapping what you can for now, adding in extra fields if you need to, and then refining the process as your projects evolve. Right, that's a bit of a quick rattle through OC4IDS and OCDS. So finally, we just have a few slides about the hackathon in particular. I know that some of you have got some questions about the hackathon. So just to remind you of the judging criteria, which were, these are just from the website from when you submitted your hackathon projects in the first place. And the one that I just wanted to emphasize a bit is under social impact. There's the question about whether what you're doing is replicable and transferable. So obviously publishing in a data standard helps with the transferability, but also think about, well, whilst you're building your projects, if there's any code or particular bits of software development you do that you think may be useful to other people, it would be great if you would like to share that, or even if it's sharing within your own organization. Often we find with OCDS the process of governments working with other departments to try and get their data together in order to publish in a set data standard has knock-on effects, and they can share both knowledge and bits of code and specific processes. So I'd encourage you to think about replicability and transferability in your projects. and also the focus on feasibility. So depending where your project is, when you get to the hackathon, part of what you might work on when you're there is thinking about future plans for it and coming up with some concrete ideas about how to move the project forward post-hackathon. And then briefly about the agenda, we're just doing some final planning and we'll share more details as soon as possible. But just to flag up, if you think you might need any technical support in Taiwan, please fill in the Google form, and we'll see if we can recruit some technical support there. I will be there to help you understand more about OC4IDS and OCDS. And I know that lots of you are taking technical teams with you, but if you need any support, please fill in that form as soon as possible. So that might be, for example, help with data scraping or reformatting data, general data wrangling, just let us know. And also to flag up, there'll be some elements of peer learning there. So we'll encourage you to work with each other on and sharing the problems that you found and different solutions. There'll also be some other participants from the national track of the hackathon, and also some previous winners from last year will be coming back to share their experiences, and we would really encourage you to try and benefit from their experience. And finally, when we get there, I think on the first day, what we'll do is that we'll get all the teams to do a short presentation just to introduce yourselves so you can get to know each other and the sort of projects that you're working on, the sorts of challenges and opportunities that you've identified and your use cases. And we'll, as I said, we'll share more details of that as soon as possible and before you come to Taiwan. Okay, so finally, as ever, if you have any questions after the webinar, please do get in touch with the help desk. We'll also share these slides and we'll share the recording of this webinar in case that's helpful. So does anybody have any questions immediately?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, Charlie, for the presentation. No. I don't know. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes. Do you have a question now?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And
Okay.
I have one question. Like on the previous discussion with you on the Google Meet, you asked about the project ID, and we have checked with the government website saying that no official published one, only the string that is generated by the system. So for this case, what do you think we should do?
Yes, so I saw your email this morning and I'll respond in greater detail. I think, I guess the key research issue is trying to understand how the government can distinguish between the different infrastructure projects and the various phases that belong to it. So if the government department that we were looking at doesn't have its own identifier for projects, it may be that there's another way from different departments that they use in common to refer to particular infrastructure projects. So given that governments often have to refer to infrastructure projects uniquely, the research task is to try and work out precisely how they do that. And what we might need to do is work out a way to use different identifiers that the government attaches to infrastructure projects and combine them in order to make one particular identifier. But the key point is what we need to do is try and look at different sources of information in order that we can have one unique project identifier that we can use so we know precisely what infrastructure project we're talking about. So I think on this point, what we need to do is to try and do a bit more research and try and figure out how we can generate a project identifier.
So it's important to understand how the government generated. We cannot just like do it by ourselves and generating some coding for it. No, possible.
Yes, we can. I guess the important thing is to make clear how what you publish relates to the source data.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll have a look at the email that you sent me, and I'll send you some suggestions of a good way forward.
Thank you for that. And I also have another question.
Okay.
Regarding the level of you have shown that OC4IDS have 3 levels, right? We have project level, contract summary, contract detail.
Yeah.
I wonder whether if we work only on the level 1, is that fully telling the whole information about the contract? I mean, we don't, if we just do only 1 level and leave out the other 2, is that still complete, fully provide fully information for that? Or we have to work on level 1, 2, and 3, all of it to make it complete?
So I guess for now, I would think about just publishing whatever you can. So because I think publishing OC4IDS will be an incremental process. So particularly in the context of a hackathon, you only have a short amount of time to publish, to assemble and publish all the information. So for the purposes of the hackathon project, I would look at how you map the existing data that you have and just publish what is available rather than worrying too much about making it complete. What we're interested in, I guess, is some example OC4IDS data, and I think you're working on some visualizations as well, aren't you, from the data?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that it also comes down to your use cases in this example. So I would publish what you can for now, and then perhaps if you have time during the hackathon, you could work on an implementation plan for how you would populate the other levels.
Okay.
So I would suggest that you complete the mapping template first, so then you know, Charlie and I can have a look to see what you have. So exactly as Charlie says. So let's take a look at what you have. So you might have, you know, some data at level 1 and some data at level 2 and some data at level 3, and you might not have all of it at each level, but we can work with that, as Charlie said. So that's what she means by an incremental approach. I mean, ideally, just having level 1 project information is not really going to be that useful in itself. So depending on what the use case is, so what your project is trying to solve, I mean, I doubt that the level 1 project data in of itself will be able to get you to the answers that you want. So, you know, let's take a look at what you have, and then let's see what the way forwards is.
Mm-hmm. I see. Thank you.
Great. And okay, great. And I can see in a chat a question about a single project, which is both design and construction. Yeah, you don't need to split the contract into 2. You can just use design and construction in the contract nature. So I'll also send an example of that after the call. And if you have any example data, please also share that with us. Great. Has anyone else got any questions? We have a few minutes left.
Charlie, it's Michael from Australia.
Hello.
I guess it's more a general question about the hackathon and the way it works. I mean, obviously got some great info from yourselves and Open Contracting Partnership. What is the role of the Taiwanese government and the people involved in the hackathon there going to be during the event and things? I mean, there's obviously a bit of publicity around it and things. I just want to get a better understanding from a, I guess, yeah, public arena perception of how things are going to run and whether how everything's going to run on that side of things.
Ben, is that something that you can cover perhaps?
Yes, of course. Good question, Michael. So essentially, the Taiwanese government are the hosts and the organizers of the event, and the Open Contracting Partnership are knowledge partners. So we're supporting them with working with the teams, for example, as we have been with you and the other teams here, and providing technical support on the OCDS and OC4IDS, for example, as Charlie has done on this webinar. So basically, the short answer is that the Taiwanese government are running the whole show, and we're in a technical supporting capacity as and when they ask us to. They are working on the agenda at the moment, which I expect they will release shortly. We're helping them a little bit with that as well, to help them design and develop the agenda. I expect that they will be sending that out soon to the participants, so you get some information of how the days will run. The idea is that the teams should do as much work as possible on your projects and your prototypes in the run up to Taiwan. So do as much as you can now, so that you can get a really robust offering, so that in the final 3 days when you are in Taipei, it's really just the final push and you won't be starting everything from scratch. Does that answer your question, Michael, or did you want something more? Did you have a more specific question than that?
No, that's good. I mean, there was a bit of media requests that came through from the Taiwanese side last week. So I was just wondering if you had any more insights on that. But I think, yeah, it sounds like it's a question I need to direct to their side, as they're the ones asking for it. So that's fine. That's been helpful though. Thank you.
Sorry, what were they asking for?
Just some like a quick video, like media presentation on the team, and then a few other things around that. I haven't looked at it in detail yet, but yeah, that's fine. I'll go back to them.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, so it's 9 o'clock. So I've just had a request for a sample complete format. Do you mean, sorry, I've just replied to say there's an example OC4IDS file in the documentation. Did you mean that you want an example of OCDS? Okay, I'll find an example of OCDS and I'll share it with everybody. So in the meantime, thank you very much for joining. Please let us know if there's any more questions. David in the chat has put a post-event survey quick questionnaire, so it'll just take a couple of minutes of your time, and we'd really appreciate it if you fill that in. I'll also send through links to everybody via email later on. And thank you very much for joining. That's it from us, and I look forward to seeing you all in Taiwan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.